So we're in Acts 19 this morning, Acts 19, and we're going to look at verses 13 through 41. So Acts 19, 13 through 41. This could be, I mean, it probably is without a doubt, the weirdest portion of the book of Acts. This is the tail end of Paul's ministry in the city of Ephesus. And Paul has two really bizarre responses to his ministry, thanks to some Jewish exorcists and to a Greek silversmith. And I think the best application I can see to this section of Paul's journey as a whole is that God is going to continue to work even when the world seems really confusing and really messed up around us. God will be faithful to work in the lives of his people. So when our lives don't make sense, people are acting in ways that are just bizarre, we can trust that God will bring us through those confusing times and continue to be gracious to us. But the confusion starts with some people who tried to imitate Paul in Acts 19:30, but also some of the Jewish exorcists who went from place to place, attempted to name over those who had the evil spirits in the name of the Lord Jesus, saying, I adjure you by Jesus whom Paul preaches. So 2 weeks ago, we talked about how miraculous works were being done by Paul in the city of Ephesus. Not only were miraculous works being done by Paul personally, but we talked about how there was this amazing moment in Ephesus where they were taking clothes off of Paul, putting those on people, and miracles were still being done in the name of Christ through Paul. And this resulted obviously in fame for Paul in the city of Ephesus. And what normally always accompanies fame in this world, somebody gets famous for something, everybody else tries to copy that person or that group who got famous. And so Paul gets some copycats. And we've seen this all throughout church history. Probably the first large group of copycats of the Christian church were known as the Gnostics. The largest group of the copycats of Christianity would be the religion of Islam, which clearly, if you read the Quran, that's, birthed right out of, twists and changes of Judaism and Christianity. And then today we have the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses who corrupt and twist the teachings of Christ. So we've always had people who've seen the power, the life-changing work of the gospel in Jesus Christ and have tried to duplicate it for their own personal gain. And we have sort of a humorous instance of somebody trying to steal the power of Christ in verses 14 through 17. 7 sons of one Sceva, a Jewish chief priest, were doing this. And the evil spirit answered and said to them, I recognize Jesus, and I know about Paul, but who are you? And the man in whom was the evil spirit leaped on them and subdued all of them and overpowered them, so that they fled out of the house, naked and wounded. This became known to all, both Jews and Greeks who lived in Ephesus, and fear fell upon all of those, and the name of the Lord Jesus was being magnified. So we should make a few historical notes about what occurs here. First is this character Sceva. It says the 7 sons of Sceva. We have no idea who this Sceva is. Luke calls him a Jewish chief or a Jewish high priest, which probably means one of two things. One, it could mean that Sceva is from the family of the Jewish high priest, but never actually took on that role of high priest. We have pretty thorough records actually of all of the people who served as high priests during that first century of history of 1 AD during that time period, and there was never a Sceva who was a high priest at all. So he could be from the family of the high priest who just never actually took on that role. Or second, Sceva, and I think this is probably the more likely, Sceva just lied about who he was. He tricked people into thinking he was a Jewish high priest, and his sons used that deception in order to gain clout and to gain a following. Second, we should also note that Jewish exorcists were well known. It was a common practice during this time period, and it went on for a couple hundred years after this. We actually have records in the catacombs of Paris that is talking about how to do magic incantations for Jewish exorcists. Apparently, just the nature of Judaism, with the rituals that they had in the worship of the temple, combined with the sounds of Hebrew, the Hebrew language, in the ears of the Romans, led a lot of Romans to think that Jews had special spiritual powers in order to cast out demons. And you had some Jews who took advantage of that. They would say some random words in Hebrew. People would think it was a magical incantation, and they could cast out demons. So these seven sons of Sceva were known for their exorcisms in Ephesus, and they're like, hey, we're tricking people to think that we're exorcists. This guy Paul's the real deal, and he's doing it. So let's use the name of Paul, and let's use the name of Jesus, and let's really cast out these demons. And when they tried to use the names of Jesus and Paul, well, the demon would have none of it. And he exposed them for their error. And this is another instance in the New Testament of what we could just straight up call demonic confessions of the name of Christ. And when I say demonic confessions, I mean it's demons making confessions. The demons knew who Jesus was. They knew who Paul was. As seen in the gospel, it's confirmed here again in the early years of the church, the demons were never in doubt as to the nature and the person of Jesus as the Son of God. And it's kind of tragic how demons could see the glory of Christ very often with more clarity than the individuals who are made in the image of God, and that is every person in this world. So the demon decides to make sport of these seven men. He beats them up, strips them naked, and sends them running out naked through the town. Now, one other thing that sort of should highlight the actions of the demons even more is that the Jews during this time period were especially modest. Very legalistic Jews would cover their entire bodies. Women would have all of their hair covered totally. And so to send these men out naked, this would be the deepest of humiliation. It'd probably ruin any future business practices for these seven young men, because who's going to want to hire the exorcist who had to run around town naked from a demon? And the result is what we would expect. These seven men are shamed and humiliated for trying to misuse the name of Jesus Christ. News of this spreads like wildfire, and more glory comes to Christ. More fear of the name of the Lord comes upon them, and it creates an even stronger response against what Paul has been doing for the glory of Christ. You see this in verses 18 through 22. Many of them who had believed kept coming and confessing and disclosing their practices. And many of those who practiced magic brought their books together and began burning them in the sight of everyone. And they counted up the price of them and found it 50,000 pieces of silver. So the word of the Lord was growing mightily and prevailing. Now, after these things were finished, Paul purposed in the Spirit to go to Jerusalem, after he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. And having sent into Macedonia two of those who ministered to him, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. So we have really two almost extremely opposite responses to Paul's ministry at this point. We have the good response, and then we have the extreme bad response. So the good response is basically an old-fashioned book burning, but a book burning was a much bigger deal then than it is now. The reason for that is books today are aplenty, and books today are relatively cheap. Books back then were so valuable. They were worth so much money. It was an extremely painstaking process in order to write out an entire book, which led to their value. And, the book lover that I am, I read this passage, and part of me is just like, I know these books are about demonic pagan things, but oh man, they're burning ancient books. And we read here that the retail value of these books, according to Luke, was 50,000 pieces of silver. And to put that into context, based on what a worker's day wage is, The value of these books is about 150 years of wages in the Roman Empire. So we're talking an insane amount of money, a great sacrifice to serve the Lord. And it also, I think, the value of these books pictures for us also the sacrifice of the early church in making the copies that they made of the Gospels and the Epistles and Acts, and to have that spread across. They dedicated a large sum of money to have the New Testament spread, as we can see, for the value of books for that time period. But the burning of the books was a physical way for these former magicians, these men who were involved in dark, demonic works, to demonstrate that they were walking away from the darkness and they were walking into the light of Jesus Christ. And while we in our lives, we do not need to get legalistic and say, you gotta burn your old books and burn your old movies and CDs or whatever in order to walk with Christ. But if we're honest, probably some of us could probably use with some good burning down of activities that might draw us away from Jesus Christ and serving Him. For some people, it could be cutting up credit cards that are ruining their lives with debt. For other people, it could be blocking websites that are on their computer. Maybe it could be stepping out in courageous obedience to do something that you have been afraid to do before. But I think costly obedience in the end is the most rewarding form of obedience. And follow to this obedience, we almost have sort of kind of snuck into the text a verse here that's more important than we might think it is, because it's so crucial to the structure of Acts. But we read in verse 17 that Paul makes it his goal, and from this point forward, Paul's goal is to go to the city of Rome. And from this point on, the narrative of the book of Acts is going to be driven by Paul's desire to go to Rome and to bring the gospel to Rome. And sort of the fascinating thing about how God works in unexpected, mysterious ways is that Paul's like I'm going to Rome. That's my plan. But before Paul goes to Rome, he's like, I got to go to these other places, and I got to go to Jerusalem first. And if you know anything about very basic geography, Paul at this point is about halfway in the Roman Empire between Jerusalem and Rome, and then goes the opposite way. He goes back to Jerusalem, but by going to Jerusalem, it will end up being that the Romans will pay for his trip to go back to Rome and allow him to have an audience before Caesar. So God works in mysterious ways where Paul actually going the opposite way of Rome ends up leading for him to be able to get all the way to that city. And then when the other people in the city of Ephesus see this very costly burning of these books, we see the second extreme response to Paul's ministry, and this is the extreme opposition in verses 23 to 34. About this time, there occurred no small disturbance concerning the way. For a man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Artemis, that's also the Greek god Diana, Artemis, same goddess, Greek and Roman names. Artemis was bringing no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen of similar trades and said, Men, you know that our prosperity depends upon this business. You see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a considerable number of people, saying that gods made with hands are no gods at all. Not only is there danger that this trade of ours fall into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis be regarded as worthless, and that she, whom all of Asia and the world worship, will be dethroned from her magnificence. And when they heard this and were filled with rage, they began crying out and saying, Great is Artemis of the Ephesians! The city was filled with confusion, and they rushed with one accord into the theater, dragging along Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia. And when Paul wanted to go into the assembly, the disciples would not let him. Also, some of the Asarocs, who were friends of his, sent to him and repeatedly urged him, not to enter into the theater. So then some were shouting one thing and some another, for the assembly was in confusion. And the majority did not know for what reason they had come together. Some of the crowd concluded it was Alexander, since the Jews had put him forward. And having motioned with his hand, Alexander was intending to make a defense to the assembly. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, a single outcry arose from all as they shouted for about 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!" So the result of this book burning ends up just being chaos in Ephesus. And the chaos isn't from the followers of the way who burned their books, but the chaos came from a silversmith by the name of Demetrius, who realized very quickly what the worship of Jesus Christ would mean for his trade and for his entire religion and for his entire way of life. Demetrius realized that Jesus Christ was the death of polytheism, the death of the worship of the gods. And sort of the intriguing thing is that Demetrius was exactly right. It took a couple hundred years for this to become reality, but he saw it coming. Because what ended up being the result of Jesus and the Christian church in the Roman Empire? The result was the end of Roman polytheism. Jesus is the end of the pagan worship of the false gods. And since he, as a silversmith, since his entire business was built around crafting these idols for people to worship, he had to get rid of and do whatever he could to oppose the gospel. There would have been two types of idols that would have been crafted by men like Demetrius out of silver at this time period. And that was, they crafted idols of Diana herself or Artemis. You can see an image of one that's on the screen that we still have today. And then also they made recreations of the famous temple that everybody would want to go see at that time period, the Temple of Artemis. You could think that it'd be similar if you went to New York City. You'd come home with your little Statue of Liberty. So if you go and visit Ephesus, you'd come home with your little recreation of the temple. And one of the great ironies is that we have recreations of the temple. We have recreations of Diana today, and we have them in numerous different materials in which they've been made. But one of the materials that did not survive antiquity was these idols being made out of silver. The reason behind that is silver's kind of valuable, and once people stop worshiping the gods, what are they going to do with the silver idols? They're going to burn those down and turn them into other things. So the works of Demetrius ended up being the one material that actually didn't survive. Further illustrating that Demetrius, he had a point. He saw exactly what was going to happen. He saw that they were going to crush his business if people continued to convert to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so the way that he tried to oppose Paul was a way that people had tried to oppose Paul in numerous cities leading up to this point. And that is Demetrius started a riot. He gathered together various tradesmen and proclaimed that the gospel of Jesus Christ was a threat to their entire city. And in a way, he was right. The gospel was a threat to the way of life in Ephesus. At this time period, the city of Ephesus was really maybe more so than any city in the Roman Empire. This city was centered upon the worship of a single god. The temple to Artemis, the temple of Diana, was really the grandest of all pagan temples of the ancient world. If you were to look up the seven wonders of the ancient world, the temple to Diana is listed there as one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. And on top of that, Diana, Artemis, was seen as the goddess of fertility. And so they also believed, how were we able to grow our crops? Because we worship Diana. How would we be able to have our wives get pregnant? Because of our worship to Diana. And so not only did they see the overthrow of pagan worship as a threat to all of the business that would go into the temple, but they saw it as a threat to the growing of their crops on the hillside, their ability to have children. Like to them, this was a threat to everything. And I think where we live today, we could have a very simple illustration of how a city might respond to someone who preached a gospel that would threaten a major part of the city, and that is living here in New Orleans. If you had someone show up in New Orleans preaching the gospel anew and preaching it in a way that clearly was going to bring an end to the celebration of Mardi Gras, you would have people riot. I mean, right now you have people threaten to riot if the city changes rules about how long you can keep your chair set up on the neutral ground. So if somebody was actually going to end the Mardi Gras parades, there would be a riot because of that, like mass chaos. And that's what we see happening here. Men are marching in the city, they're demonstrating, they're shouting again and again, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." They drag a couple of Paul's companions into the city court to have them beaten, and there's just confusion all over the place. And you see, I think, the greatest confusion with this odd note about this Jew named Alexander. And the weird thing about this is, based on what we can tell in the text, Alexander's not a Christian. They just mistook him as a Christian. Alexander was just actually a Jew. And they brought him in there because they were probably assuming at this point that since Jesus was the Jewish Messiah that they were preaching, that then all Jews must have been supportive of the way. And so Alexander was trying to be up there and to be like, us Jews are also in opposition to these Christians. And they're like, no, this Jew's probably one of them. And it just used them a chance to try to, beat down a Jew with their anti-Semitism. But I think bringing up Alexander and the threat that was put upon him as a Jew was just a way for Luke to sort of illustrate these people had no idea what they were doing. Like, they were bringing people up to try to persecute them who weren't even involved with Paul and the way and what they were doing. Like, these people had no idea what was going on. It was just mass confusion. Probably anytime you get a big group of people and their way of trying to convince people of their viewpoint is to simply chant and repeat the same phrase over and over again, probably a low IQ group of people that don't know what it is that they're talking about. The city is in an uproar. They want to find Paul. Paul wants to go in there. The other Christians won't let him get in there. They're lumping Jews and Christians together. People are chanting and screaming. It is crazy. And then finally, the town clerk steps up in order to try to get some order into the city. And we see that in verses 35 to 41. After quieting the crowd, the town clerk said, "Men of Ephesus, what man is there, after all, who does not know that the city of Ephesus is guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of the image which fell down from heaven? So, since these are undeniable facts, you ought to keep calm and to do nothing rash. For you have brought these men here who are neither robbers of temples nor blasphemers of our goddess. So then, if Demetrius and the craftsmen who are with him have a complaint against any man, the courts are in session and proconsuls are available. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you want anything beyond this, it shall be settled in the lawful assembly. For indeed, we are in danger of being accused of a riot in connection with today's events, since there's really no cause for it. And in this connection, we will be unable to account for this disorderly gathering." After saying this, he dismissed the assembly. So this is another time in the ministry of Paul where we have a secular ruler who sides with the Christians, who sides with Paul and the followers of the way. And I think this is an important note to remember. We should not, as believers, always assume that we have an adversarial role against a politician who is not a Christian. Unbelievers can be reasonable in the positions that they've given them. I think Abraham, one of the lessons he was supposed to learn was that Abimelech, the king of Gerar, he wasn't unreasonable, but he could be reasoned with. And Paul learns the same lesson here in his missionary journey. So if we ever have a point where we are put before political leaders for the sake of the gospel, we need to just be clear in our presentation of the truth and pray that they will deliver wise rulings in their leadership of the land. We should remember that political rulers, by and large, are to be seen as a good, as a gift to the church, and we should view them appropriately in that manner. While sometimes they can be a curse, we should try to be wise in our dealings before them. So the town clerk gets before all of the city, and his biggest concern is not Paul It's not the church, but his biggest concern is the strong arm of Rome, and that the Roman might and power will fall hard upon the city of Ephesus for being a disorderly city. We need to understand that Rome ruled by fear and intimidation. This went for both the enemies of Rome and also the cities who were under the jurisdiction of Rome. Because really, the last thing that the emperor really wanted, regardless of what generation it was, of the various cities under his empire, the last thing he wanted was a headache. Like he didn't want riots in cities. He didn't want unrest. So if there was civil unrest in a city, like Rome's going to march a legion of soldiers in there, and they're going to brutally put down whatever riot that is. So the town clerk is like, guys, we need to think. Like the worst case scenario here is not that this Paul guy keeps talking about Jesus. The worst case scenario is that all of a sudden a legion of troops are brought in and we're all beaten up, killed with spears in order to put down this riot. So he's like, you guys, you need to calm down. And so he calms down this crowd, although again, we can look at it from the long-term perspective and end up being like, well, long-term, it wasn't the soldiers who are biggest threats to Roman polytheism. It really ended up being the church because they were the downfall to it, but they did get their momentary peace because of the wisdom of this town clerk. And one of the ways that he reassured them, interestingly enough, was by basically pointing to their great temple, talking about how amazing Artemis and Diana was, and being like, how could this Jesus ever seek to overcome the glory of our temple and our goddess? And the great irony was that Jesus did overcome their temple and the worship to their goddess. They could overcome it all. And so there's some humor in this passage. I think Luke, even as he's penning it, can't see that Christianity would be the ultimate long-term downfall of Ephesus and the polytheistic worship of this time period, but it was. So, it's kind of funny when people talk about the Roman faith today. They don't think, when they're thinking about Roman religion, you don't think about the polytheism of the Roman gods. You think about the Roman bishop of the Roman Catholic Church. And so we can see how the church ended up really having an unexpected victory over the city of Ephesus. Paul would not only end up making a humiliation of the practice of Jewish exorcism, but would also lead to the downfall of the worship of Artemis. So just a shocking change and a reminder for us that when it comes to great changes in this world from the gospel, very often it isn't something that occurs through great political changes or massive revivals that take place over a short period of time, but usually it's the long-term evangelism, slowly winning over one person after another for the gospel, and that brings great change to a society and a culture. One more note in this chapter as it relates to the nature of the church. The word church that we use today to refer to a body of believers, we're Grace Community Bible Church. The word church comes from the Greek word ekklesia, and ekklesia is not the name for a religious gathering. Ekklesia is not the name for people who worship Christ, but the word ekklesia is actually used 3 times in this chapter. Each time we read in verse 32, 39, and verse 40 that talk about the gathering of this mob of people in Ephesus. This mob is referred to as an ekklesia, because an ekklesia is a public or corporate gathering of a group of people. And I think this is important to understand the nature of the church. I do not believe that the church of Jesus Christ is made up of every believer in Jesus Christ. If you believe in Jesus, you're a believer in Jesus, you're part of the body of Jesus Christ. But the church, based on, in my opinion, the fundamental definition of the word ekklesia, the church is when believers gather together. So I don't believe there's this, an invisible church that's spread out over the whole world. But the church is every time a group of people gather together in the worship of Christ. That's why we read in the Bible about the church of Ephesus, the church of Philippi, the church of Rome, because the church is the gathering of the people of God. So if someone isn't gathering together, they're really not part of the church. The church is when we come together and meet for the worship of Jesus Christ, for the practicing of the ordinances of the Lord's Supper and baptism. It's working together. And I think seeing this definition of church just is a reminder that the Christian walk, the Christian life is never meant to be a solo work. You can't do church alone. You got to gather together with the people to be part of the church. And sadly, you can have people who are part of the body of Jesus Christ. They're saved, they're going to be in glory forever, but they're not currently part of the church because they're not gathering together. So we should always remember the importance of coming together to praise the Lord, to glorify his name, to encourage the saints. So we should seek to make that a priority in our lives, that we're always part of the gathered people of God.